everybody. Andrew here from Polo Reef. Over the years, we have learned a lot about reef keeping. We are ready to pass that information and knowledge off to you. We are going to be taking many concepts of the commercial aquarium and bringing them to the hobbyists. Welcome to Polo University. Hi everybody, Andrew here. Today we're going to discuss quarantine basics. And later on, in different videos, we'll get into some more advanced quarantine and medications. This series will be helping our reefers and hope to make you guys better reef keepers. Here's the syllabus for today's lesson. 1, review why we need to quarantine. 2, talk about the equipment that's needed. 3, walk through the Polo Reef flow chart. And 4, how to apply this in your own aquarium.
The process you're about to see is what works here at Polo Reef. Our method is designed specifically for our tanks and is not the only method that works. Take time to understand your system and make decisions that will work for you. Polo Reef is not responsible for decisions made in your own home aquarium.
Before we begin, it is important to understand and know that every species of fish requires some sort of different quarantine procedure. In the upcoming episodes, we'll be dividing the quarantine specifics based on fish species. We will also be doing depth reviews of the medications we talk about today. So this is a great time to remind to hit that subscribe and like button so we can bring this content to you. So why do we need to quarantine? I think it's pretty obvious. Using quarantine as a system so that we don't get what we call, I wiped out my tank and I hate this hobby. Can't tell you how many times that's happened to people where they introduce new fish and they wipe out their tanks. So this particular system will be designed so that doesn't happen. Oftentimes fish get stressed that causes their immune system to weaken, opening up for infections and disease. To prevent this, quarantine is used as a buffer between the rest of your fish in your display tank and making sure the new guy does not harm them. So what do we need to start a quarantine system? Here at Polo Reef, we have this on a large scale and they're continuously going. We only have 3 systems done, essentially, because 4 or 5 is 1, right?
4 and 5 are 1 system.
Right. And 1 and 2. And then the other one, oh no, 1 is a coral, 2, 3. At Polo Reef, we have 4 quarantine systems, each in the 500-gallon range. As a matter of fact, 4 and 5 are actually connected to make 1,000. And number 1 is for coral. So we use 2, 3, and 4, 5. They have their own sumps, their own bio balls, their own system. They are not linked at all, and we use them differently. The tanks we have cumulatively in quarantine add up to roughly about 2,000 gallons. And I'd say we have 5 to 7 fish per month going through the systems. Okay, I'd like to introduce you now to what we call the Polo Reef quarantine flowchart. The quarantine process really begins way before the fish arrives at your house. That's the most important thing I want to get across to you today. We must identify the fish and understand certain fish are able to tolerate certain medications better than others. Secondly, we want to know what disease this fish has a reputation to being susceptible for. It's really important. There are certain fish that just don't get ick. And then there are certain, well, you know, the ick magnets, fish like Achilles, tangs, and powder blues, that you gotta have that tank ready to go with meds the minute the fish go in. Also, where it came from, how many hours did the fish travel? And how much ammonia potentially is in that bag. These are all things that you need to know, and that's what I'm talking about by knowing the fish. Once you understand the fish you are quarantining, you are ready to move on. Obviously, they come in. We float the bags so that we adjust temperature. Temperature is the first thing we want to regulate. Side note, floating the bags should probably be at least 10 to 15 minutes. Sometimes we float them for 20 to 30 minutes to make sure that the temperature inside that bag equals the temperature of your quarantine tank. The next thing we need to do is visual inspection. What do we got? Do we have a fish that's laying, breathing heavy, laying on its side? Do we have a fish that looks great? Do we have a fish that has dots all over it already, or where you can see flukes on it? These are the things we need to look for. And the next thing we need to test for is probably the pH of that water they're in, because that also will need to be adjusted for. Salinity we talked about. There are two choices. Either get your quarantine tank to the salinity of the bag, or you're gonna have to slowly get the fish assimilated to the salinity in the quarantine tank. If all the fish are looking good, we move on to the next step. Side note, things rarely run this smoothly, especially when dealing with a lot of fish. Unfortunately, can arrive dead on arrival. They can be completely stressed and look like they're not gonna make it. Keep in mind, this is not always your fault. Now let's stop here for a minute and take a step back and look at the flow chart. Let's say during the inspection, we notice some unusual things. Before proceeding, always check the level of stress on the fish. If the fish is extremely stressed out, it is important to get the fish as comfortable as possible in good water before treating with meds. However, if any of the things that we are going to talk about, like dots or seeing velvet or seeing flukes on the fish, we're gonna go straight at it, fast, quick, to the point, and not worry about this fish's condition, because the disease is the problem. If the fish come in and you spot any of the following, you must take action, and take action decisively. Whether they're flukes in the gills or on eyes or on the body, dots from either velvet or ick, what we want to do is get this fish comfortable. And our method for that is a formalin bath. What we want to do is dip or bathe these fish in the formalin with heavy air for 30 to 45 minutes before they go into the quarantine tank. Sometimes if it's just some visual flukes, you can do a freshwater dip instead of the formalin bath. Personally, I think the formalin bath is less stressful on the fish than the freshwater dip, especially newcomers. Side note, please consult your local vet or follow the instructions on the bottle to treat your fish properly. Another big thing that could happen is your fish can arrive with red sores. Red sores can be tricky. You can't use formalin, you'll poison their blood. You can't use hydrogen peroxide for baths because that will actually irritate the wound. And you need to identify whether this is a bacterial infection, just an injury, or the dreaded urinema. Treatment for all three of those things are different. Side note, so if your fish come in with red sores, you have to change direction a little bit. It's either probably urinema. If it's bacterial, you'll have to assess how bad this bacterial infection is. And we will discuss these options in the later episodes. If the fish arrives and after opening that bag, you notice the salinity is way different than your quarantine tank, usually they come from wholesalers significantly lower, and your quarantine tank is too high. Again, you can bring that quarantine tank down to the salinity and raise it at a later point. And the way you would do that would be just to add RO and take water out of your quarantine. The other thing is, whether you want to test it or not, usually the pH, the longer the travel, is going to be low. And you're going to need to get that fish acclimated to the pH in your quarantine. The only way of doing this is water exchange. Some people call it drip methods. At Sandler, we like to go a little faster than drip. We like to mix like the bartender in shots, particularly if the fish has traveled a long time. Again, if it just came 30 minutes away from your local fish store and the salinity is different, be my guest, go drip the fish for an hour, add prime or don't add prime. It's not going to be a problem. The problem really happens overnight flights, 2 days. These fish are sitting in 7.0, 7.2 water. You open that bag, the ammonia, it takes off from the oxygen, and the salinity's low, and you have to mix to get it right. And that mixing could take 30, 40 minutes. Guys, prime that bucket or prime that bag while you're mixing the water. Ammonia is a fish killer. Whether it kills the fish right there or burns their gills and they die at a later stage. Any small space in a bag where the ammonia spikes can hurt a fish very badly. And that's why opening up that bag and letting that oxygen rush in, that will raise the pH, which raises the toxicity of the ammonia and makes the whole situation worse. Please, if the fish have been traveling for a long time, you open that bag, and you should, to test the salinity, prime the bag. Prime it. Detoxify that ammonia. Side note, always pay attention to how your fish is behaving, particularly in quarantine. Is the fish breathing heavy? Is it darting? Is it scratching? Is it yawning? These are signs of disease you need to identify so that we pick the right meds in the right orders. It's best to knock off any external parasite before it goes into your quarantine tank. It will prevent breakouts in the quarantine. So your fish has passed the visual tests. It's not stressed like crazy. It doesn't have sores. It's time for the bath. And that bath will knock off anything so it won't infest quarantine. We use a 5-gallon bucket. We use 4 milliliters of formalin, heavily aerated, 30 to 45 minutes. That fish then goes into quarantine. There's another way of doing it with hydrogen peroxide, 150 ppms of hydrogen peroxide. We'll explain that at a later session. Okay, so your fish has had a 30 to 40 minute bath. It is ready to go into the quarantine tank. That bath water should be the same temperature, the same salinity as your quarantine, and simply net the fish out and put it in quarantine. This is where there's a little art involved. There are some fish that you're going to want to have a reasonable to full amount of strength of medication already in the quarantine tank before that fish gets in there. Those are your hippo tangs, your Achilles tangs, your black tangs, your ick magnets. Once the fish enters the quarantine tank, we treat depending on where we see the most risk. So knowing that fish and knowing what disease it usually gets or comes with is key to this process. Assuming now that this is a fish we're going to treat with meds, we need to make a big decision whether we're doing these meds with copper formalin, just formalin, or chloroquine. These are sort of the base soups that I call. Side note, After the medication of copper or chloroquine or formalin is completed, we deworm with praziquantel. Praziquantel is dosed at least 2 times between 5 and 7 days apart from each other with a water change in between. The reason for that second treatment is to make sure that we get the eggs that didn't hatch yet. And once they hatch again in 6-7 days, the second round of prazi kills them. In a perfect world, nothing else will go wrong. We've treated the fish in its base soup. We've given them prazi, and we can move into the final stages, right? Not so fast. While there are times there are no other underlying issues, it is often common that we get problems in quarantine. If in quarantine you notice something, it's time you have to correct it. Things that you might see are diseases like velvet, which is like a powdered coating on the fish, ick, white dots, brucnella, where the skin looks like it's peeling off, and the dreaded urinemia, where you see red sores and actually blood essentially coming out from even the inside of the fish. Things like bruc and urinemia, we prefer to treat with an aggressive solution of formalin or chloroquine. Copper alone will not do this. In the case of a bacterial infection, we need to be moving to an antibiotic. That antibiotic preferably is best administered without copper or chloroquine in the water. However, there are times we have to combine it. So now that your fish have been in quarantine, again, the main diseases, velvet, ick, brucnella, urinemia, bacterial, and flukes. Your fish should have had at least 2 weeks, possibly 4 weeks, of either chloroquine phosphate, copper, and praziquantel. One more thing. During this last week, Polo Reef likes to medicate their food internally. And we will add fenbendazole, an antibiotic, and Metroplex to their food during their last 5 to 6 days with us in quarantine. We've proactively treated with base soups, copper, chloroquine. Your fish have been through praziquantel. Everything is looking pretty good, and the 30 days are up, and we like to do one more final bath. That final bath, once again, is either formalin or hydrogen peroxide, depending on the fish, depending on what we might suspect. Side note, there is another alternative I want to mention. That's to basically either watch them for several weeks and see if a disease breaks out and you're not medicating them at all, or doing something what's called tank transfer. Many of you know this, where you're basically moving the fish every 3rd day into a new sterile system. And what that does is anything that falls off the fish does not carry into the next tank. The fish are ready. The last bath is over. It's time to put them in your display tank. A lot of fish, new fish, will get picked on. They'll be chased. It will cause stress. The safest bet, release the fish in the evening when the lights are low or the lights are out completely. I know all of you say, I don't have enough space for a quarantine setup. You do have space. All you need is a simple 20-gallon tank. Hi, done. Filtration here is going to be the key issue. Okay? And keeping that ammonia down. Side note, you all should keep bags of bioballs, plastic bioballs that hold bacteria, or what we find works great is C-Chem Matrix in nylon bags. Just keep them in your sump, and that will house nitrifying bacteria that you could use in the filtration that you're setting up for quarantine. You will get some ammonia buildup in your quarantine tank. This is not to worry. There are two things to do about it. But once that level gets to 0.5 ppms of ammonia, you have to do something about it. Prime is one way to do it. Make sure you prime for 3 times to 5 times normal dose, and that's will hold you off until you have water to do a water change, which is the other way of reducing ammonia. And make sure when you do that water change, the water that's going in already has the medication in it. Don't wait to put the medication in after. The level must stay stable. So you have to get the water going in the same copper concentration or chloroquine concentration as exists in the quarantine tank. So while setting up your quarantine tank at home, besides the hang on the back filter with BioBalls active from your sump, other things you will need include, in case it's chilly, thanks, Yels, and you can just put it in the heater. Keep the tank 676, 77, 78. Other things you might need: power head. Thanks, Yelson. Just one of these little power heads, blowing some circulation around the tank, particularly with medications. Medications tend to suck oxygen. The way to defeat that is to move water. And the other way we move water, Yelson, an air stone. Thank you. Where you have a little air pump. Stone is connected here to the bottom, and we're making air. Presto, we have a quarantine tank. Oh, I forgot about the fish. The fish need to hide. They need a place to feel comfortable. Rocks, not a great idea. What is a good idea? Elbows and PVC. Thanks, Yels. Things like this. Small fish, things like this. You can hide in there. Big fish, you can hide in things like this. And you can even build bridges and make little houses to make them feel comfortable. Before you decide to buy a new fish, you can simply set this system up. Keep in mind, you need to use that bacteria that you've stored away in your main display. So give yourself a good amount of time. Our flow chart is available for download in the description, and it can be tailored for your system. I hope you all have enjoyed the first day of this class. Frankly, I look forward to teaching more in the coming weeks on dosages, medications, and how to use those medications properly. Show us some support by hitting that subscribe button at the bottom and hit that bell. I gotta run to my next class. See you next time.